as it say, and I suppose all of us hopefully slept well because and dreamt enough to be continuing the dreaming process today. Yesterday we had very many speeches telling us about the kind of advocacy initiatives which have made the CRPD, created the conducive environment for the CRPD, told us what the CRPD is about, and made this interrelation between research and policy making. What was extremely important in very many the interventions which came in yesterday were a lot of us, Diane telling us, Rosemary saying that, oh, don't see CRPD as the panacea, don't believe that the struggle is over. And I think that particular proposition is well taken and well accepted. So what we're going to have today is 4 researchers who have, in a way, cut their teeth on CRPD advocacy. They are like born, like you talk in terms of a pre-independence and a post-independence kind of generation. So this is the CRPD generation that I have around me. And the speaker who's going to lead the way is someone who has been into human rights advocacy, disability human rights advocacy, both before and through the CRPD. He's been kind of leading a number of legislative initiatives in his own country, Hungary, as well as been providing a lot of support to countries elsewhere, including my own. He's kind of the one rare sort of person who's bringing a lot of his activist initiative experience knowledge into the academy as a adjunct professor both here at Galway and at Nalsar, Hyderabad. So I want to begin today's morning proceedings by inviting Gabor Gombush to speak to us about what are the kind of struggles and what's the kind of envisioning that we need to do in this post-CRPD era. Gabor.
Thank you very much, Amita. Good morning, everyone. Niels Bohr, the famous physicist, used to say that prediction is always difficult, especially when it is about the future. So what I was asked to do in about 25 minutes is to foresee the large picture, what opportunities and what challenges are there and will be there in the 21st century regarding the rights of persons with disabilities. And I will be subjective. At the very same time, I will try to raise issues which then will be hopefully addressed by the researchers and by all of us here. Why did CRPD come into existence? The answer, I think, is very, very simple. Because persons with disabilities across the globe have been experiencing barriers to their full and effective participation in society. So I think that there are 2 keywords here. One is barriers and the other is participation. And I will try to focus on these 2 elements. What do I see or foresee as barriers before us and around us already in the present, because you can predict future only if the ground for the future is already here with us at the present. And also, the focus will be on participation. Because we are at a conference which is about research, about PhD thesis, and also about bringing about real changes in policy and legislation for persons with disabilities. And by the way, I sincerely believe that if and when the rights of persons with disabilities will be made really accessible to all persons with disabilities, then we will live in a world which is going to be human rights respectful to all persons. Research is about knowledge. And I think that there is some anachronism in the way how knowledge is often understood by policymakers these days. Historically, the place for knowledge creation and dissemination was the university, was the academia. Now, if you open your eyes, then you can't not see that it has changed significantly. If you want to get knowledge, then very often instead of going to the library of the university building, you just go online wherever you are, if you have an access to the internet, and you access knowledge there. But it's not only about the dissemination of knowledge, which happens in different ways these days, and will, I think, happen even more dramatically differently in the future, but the production of knowledge as well. You find a lot of non-academic knowledge on the internet. Of course, it has a number of problems. How you make sure that the knowledge you get from the internet is a valid and reliable and whatever knowledge. It's not just a manipulation of something. That's a different issue. In theory, the same problem can be raised about books. There have been a number of very misleading books disguised as scientific knowledge books. I think that one of the questionable consequences of modernity is that one particular type of knowledge was given a status which is really disproportionate and detrimental to any other form of diversity of knowledge, namely scientific knowledge. And if I want to oversimplify it a little bit, then I would say that scientific knowledge modeled by the Newtonian understanding of physics. That's the archetype of science, and I think that many of my colleagues who work in the humanities, in social sciences, in legal studies, whatever other non-natural science fields, often suffer from this dominance of the Newtonian physics paradigm. Evidently, this paradigm could dominate because it has some real strength. And I think that one of the strengths is that this produces global and universal knowledge. The theory of gravitation applies everywhere in the universe. And I don't need to explain why it is really powerful. Now, the problem is not that. That's a great thing. And I, as a former physicist, am really happy to see that physics contributed to such universal and global knowledge. The problem is that there are questions which require answers, and the answers may not be global ones. At the very same time, a lot of knowledge which never find a space in this global knowledge was also gathered by humanity and has been discredited as non-scientific, and that's not an issue itself, but there is a value statement attached immediately to that. It has no value. So now, if we look at the issue of barriers, for instance, experienced by persons with disabilities, then I would say that it is a mistaken policy to try to have a global description of what barriers are. We simply can't make it. You can identify and explore barriers only if you rely on the experiential knowledge of the individuals who face barriers. And then you can generalize some conclusions, which is necessary for any policy making. What I really want to emphasize here is that I think that if we are not going to be able to give a highly respected value to this local knowledge, then anything like expertise by experience and all the like will remain nice slogans, not given any money into its value. And many of us, persons with disabilities, have become too familiar with this tokenistic appreciation of our experience-based knowledge. what I submit is basically that any useful knowledge which we need at the early stages of the 21st century in order to fulfill the promises of aspirations, including the CRPD, we really need to heavily build and incorporate these local knowledges into our universal knowledge. I can see another deep and maybe deepening tension between various fields of human knowledge at the beginning of the 21st century. One is biomedical sciences, including multidisciplinary boundary areas of biomedicine, including biomedical ethics, which, in my opinion, is neither pure biomedical science nor ethics or bioethics. It's a very interesting interference between the two fields. And of course, we have the human rights discourse. And what I simply can't see, colleagues, is that there is any interface between the two, that there is any input from one on the other, any dialogue between these two areas of human knowledge. And while, and I think it has been a process. Yes, ADA was made in a rather participatory manner. People with disabilities in America and outside had their significant impact on the Americans with Disabilities Act. But I think that the real model how policy can be made in a participatory manner was the ad hoc committee negotiations of the CRPD itself. It was a very transparent process. I think that this was the first international human rights treaty which was negotiated in the internet era. So anyone who wants to study the travaux préparatoires of the CRPD can do it from his or her own room. Just go to the internet and you will find most of the documents related to the preparations of the convention can be found in one place, in one website. And of course, there are some missing materials there which require some research, but you can do that quite efficiently using the internet. It has been the most transparent and open process I have ever seen in my life. At the very same time, if you go to biomedical ethical discourses, then you find enormous barriers to do so, because most of these discourses happen behind rather closed doors. And I frankly never fully understood how they happen, why they happen. Just one example, near the finalization of the CRPD, the Council of Europe Bioethics Steering Committee was leading the discussions or discourses around a document which later on became the recommendations by the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe regarding mental health, basically. And what you find in that document is in sharp contradiction to what you find in the CRPD regarding involuntary treatment, involuntary admission, and also the recognition of legal capacity of people living with mental illness. Now, what happened in the CRPD, you can read among the travaux préparatoires. What happened in the Council of Europe negotiations, you can't read. At that time, as a chair of the European Network of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry, we made some email correspondence with the contact point at the Council of Europe Bioethical Steering Committee. We were interested in what is the composition of the working group, which basically drafted the text. And we were informed that it's confidential. Then we said, okay, it's confidential, although we didn't really understand why it was confidential. We asked for a confirmation that this is not confidential because there might have been some conflict of interests of the members of the working group. We have never received any answer to this question, frankly. So I do not want to draw conclusions, but what disturbs me is that conclusions cannot be drawn. And while it's only a recommendation, it's not binding, my experience is that in many Council of Europe countries, a Council of Europe recommendation is more often read or at least consulted by the policymakers than a universal human rights instrument like the CRPD. I frankly don't know what can be done with the tension which is there between these two fields. And then if we go to biomedical sciences at large, then another component of the tension comes in. There is an industry based on or built on biomedical knowledge, from genetic manipulations to everything basically. And obviously the address of those activities is impairment. And the promise is that using these high-tech biomedical interventions, you can prevent or fix impairments. And at the same time, in the human rights discourse, we are talking about the barriers, and we emphasize that disability is not equal to the impairment, and we want to address the barriers. Again, yesterday we had an interesting short discussion about the cochlear implants as one example. I think that many other examples come into play, and we have to have our own discourses on how to react to those challenges, which are already there. It's not really available for too many people at the moment, but it can become a massive issue in the near future. So now I am jumping into some CRPD rights, and I try to relate it to the challenges regarding participation. First of all, the participation which the CRPD foresees is not any kind of participation. It's a very particular participation. And participation, what is the role of participation? Is it a tool in the CRPD, or is it a goal of the CRPD? And I would say that for me it is both. The CRPD has a number of provisions which basically require measures by the state parties to ensure participation by persons with disabilities in basically every areas of social life. Think of Article 4, Paragraph 3, on close consultations and active involvement of persons with disabilities, including children with disabilities, through their representative organizations. Or think on the article on national monitoring and implementation. But basically it's throughout the convention. But Article 1 clearly says or implies that the goal, the purpose of the convention is to make sure that people with disabilities with their impairments are going to be able to participate in social life effectively and fully on an equal basis of others. This is a participation under the framework of equality, which is a new understanding of equality, I think, and Rosemary yesterday really spoke about it. This is not a formal equality, it is substantive equality. But when we talk about substantive equality, we should not understand only that it is something which should appear in the outcomes also. It is something which really respects diversity of the human condition. And this is a huge challenge. How to operationalize equality when we do not want to, to put all people into the same uniform. How to understand, how to test equality when we want to do that in conjunction with the respect for diversity. What is also implied here, I think, is intersectionality and multiple discrimination which may come from it. What legislative and policy and whatsoever other measures we can effectively institute and implement to address those forms of multiple discrimination which are not simply the sums of discriminations on several individual grounds, but a qualitatively new phenomenon. Capacity. If persons' capacities are not recognized and not supported if people cannot enjoy their capacities to their fullest extent, then participation will not be the participation which is foreseen in the CRPD and which is necessary for a society where persons with disabilities appear at every corner which is populated and inhabited by humankind. Until now, we see that the majority of persons with disabilities live in ghettos. They can be physical institutions, they can be virtual ghettos, but large spaces which are available for non-disabled people in general are still not available for most people with disabilities. Now, the CRPD, I think, raises capacity as a central concern, at least in two interrelated aspects. It speaks about the evolving capacities of the child, and these evolving capacities of the child shall be exercised and enjoyed with available age and disability sensitive assistance. At the same time, Article 12 is about the universal legal capacity, a recognition of that, for all persons with disabilities on an equal basis with others. And again, if and when the person needs support, then support needs to be made available for the person to exercise their legal capacity. I think that you can go to any country which started some thinking or planning about the implementation of Article 12, you will receive the very same questions from the policymakers. What is supported decision making? Tell me, describe me, operationalize it, give me the model, give me the algorithm. What am I supposed to do? What will happen when a person needs medical treatment, but the person can give a consent or refusal to the treatment only with support? How I, as a doctor, will be able to understand what's going on and whether it's okay for me, it's compliant with my medical duties and ethical commitments to accept that form of a consent. And a number of questions are very much there, and I would say that a number of answers are there. Still, they belong mostly to what I called in the beginning as local knowledge, which can be also called anecdotal knowledge. It doesn't have the status of scientific knowledge, evidential knowledge, which policymakers are really hungry for. I am not saying that it is just about a simple reinterpretation of the status of this knowledge, because I really think that when global knowledge, universal scientific sort of knowledge, including soft sciences, and this local knowledge should be put into one realm of human knowledge, then they should interact with each other. And I really think that we have to do a lot of systematizing of the anecdotal or local knowledges we have, for instance, about the supports, which for some or many people with disabilities can be enormously useful when they want to exercise their legal capacity, which is recognized under the CRPD. Independent living and participation in the community is another crucial element and article in the CRPD. Very often I use the metaphor of the CRPD being a tree. And tree is a metaphor for life. And for me, CRPD is not a panacea, but CRPD was made by alive people with a dominant impact from people with disabilities, and they wanted life to flourish for all persons with disabilities and all people in general. And if Article 12 is the root of the CRPD, which is really necessary for us to have anything on the tree, then I would say that Article 19, living independently and being involved in the community, is the fruit of the tree. But all gardeners know that it is not enough to deal with the root of the tree. You can't forget about the fruit itself, because there is no guarantee that the fruit will be healthy and vivid if you don't pay attention to it. So I think living independently and being involved in the community is one of the goals or aspirations of the CRPD, but you have to pay special attention to it as a dedicated right, if you like, talking about this in a human rights language. Participation in mainstream discourses by people with disabilities is still, I would say, very much missing. Although I see a huge shift, and if you go to the global arenas, for instance in the UN, then you can see unprecedented presence of disability in any kind of UN discourses. But if you go to local arenas or domestic arenas, or by the way, regional arenas, then too often disability discourse is segregated into conferences which are about disability, or maybe about vulnerable groups, or maybe about poverty, but it is not really part of whatever mainstream discourse is about anything. I think that we agree that if and when the CRPD is implemented, it is to bring about not only, or even I would say not primarily legislative and policy changes, but huge cultural changes. It is going to be a cultural revolution, not in the Chinese sense, hopefully. Now, how can we change culture? I think what came out from the previous week's summer school is that discourse is a very important and powerful instrument to bring about changes in the culture. But you have to be present in the mainstream discourse. You have to be able to follow what happens in mainstream culture, and you have to be able to contribute to those discourses, to have your impact on what culture is about and how the global mainstream culture is understood by all people. One of the major barriers there is intellectual property rights and related issues, which prevent a number of people with disabilities in their access to cultural materials. Now, I selected somewhat arbitrarily a few, I think, very important rights named and enshrined in the CRPD, where I see much role for new knowledge and systematization of existing local knowledge and its mainstreaming into global knowledge, and which is required for full and effective participation of persons with disabilities. The test of the pudding is eating. How do we know that what policymakers do, or let's start sweeping the house around our own house, how can we know that what we do as researchers who really do our research with the view of enabling, empowering people to take on their own lives, to open up every room in this huge building of humanity for all persons with disabilities, if we don't test it? And the way how the CRPD itself foresees this testing is national level monitoring and implementation, Article 33, which again should happen in a really participatory manner. In the discussion by the researchers, I think all these areas will be addressed, namely legal capacity, living independently and being involved in the community, access to cultural materials, and monitoring at the national level. I really do think that this is a huge challenge before us. And if I want to name two non-disability related obstacles before us, then I would name two, again arbitrarily. One is that the climate is not really, the global climate is not really favorable for human rights in general. And the other is that we have so many huge challenges, from global climate change to poverty, wars here and there, instability in international politics. I live in Hungary. There is a war going on in our neighborhood in Ukraine. The situation is very scary. And if we want to survive as persons with disabilities, then again, we need to have a special attention on us. And I think that in the global community is not very much understood yet, that when we request for that attention, then we are not willing to get anything more than non-disabled peers, just the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabor. What I would sort of want to draw the attention of all of you here, and possibly get some first level responses and then move to my young colleagues. Gabor was sort of putting a thrust on, I would say, at one very major level, of course, he made a big case for the right to participation, both as tool as well as goal. And to say that, all right, if we are to envision disability human rights as a reality, then the right to participation is something on which there has to be a very specific kind of focus. But he also spoke about what are the kind of barriers to be able to achieve that right to participation. And therein, one significant one, which comes in from a paradigm, I suppose, outside the entire CRPD paradigm, is the manner in which work is happening in the whole realm of biomedical ethics, the way in which people with disabilities, as well as the, you could say, how people with disabilities participation is being envisioned in that paradigm is totally in opposition to how the CRPD is viewing it. So the tension between these two paradigms, I think, would need to be very squarely faced, and what kind of strategies that we would think is an appropriate way to face them would be, for me, the first question which emerges from Gabor's talk. I'm deliberately foregrounding this before coming to the more positive agenda he's putting on, because these are developments which are happening simultaneously. Also, I think all of us who were a party to the entire negotiations in the ad hoc committee on the CRPD are aware of the fact that the entire biomedical community, in fact, bypassed the CRPD process. They were nowhere there. And most of them thought that it did not have too much bearing on the work that they were doing. So when the CRPD arrived and people started to challenge systems which were, subsisting for a fair period of time, to say that, fine, I have a right to liberty on an equal basis with others, right to physical and mental integrity, on an equal basis with others, you suddenly sort of found that there was a discourse of no force happening, there was a discourse of informed consent coming to the fore, and the way in which things seem to be moving is that the biomedical sciences are carrying on with their own articulation discourse without any kind of dialogue on what's happened in the CRPD. The fact that the CRPD is a binding convention, I think, has very significant bearing on the sort of negotiation or bargaining or stopping in tracks which can be done by using the CRPD. But I still would want to throw open to the House as the first question as to how do we address this very oppositional kind of currents, you would say, And is it like you, because I'm sort of, it's also represented in the mental health legislations which are coming in post the CRPD in all manner of countries, and the disability rights legislations which are coming. You find that legal capacity as it's being addressed in mental health legislations and legal capacity as it's being addressed in disability rights legislations is kind of quite at variance with each other. And you possibly can't have this whole construction of capacity being in such oppositional terms. So what kind of strategies, what's the way in which we should, let's say, resolve this tension or at least minimize this tension would be the first question I would want to put to the House. And anybody?
Thank you for opportunity to discuss this issue, which I try to understand. I think we are the same galaxy. We are human. Any model for survive, we need to talk each other, but seems to be CRPD is concerned with mental issue. For me, I think it's connection between mental and physical, very important question. And if we ignore, especially on research ground, the exploration, but for your question concerned with how to address, I have direct experience, but I don't want to talk much about my direct, but for my finding for a few years, to understand the model of scientific medical things, I found that first thing we have to identify. Identify means data. Data not means manual data, electronic data. I like to use the witness, like people talk about voice of disability who want to have right to live. But for me, concerned with right to life, I talk in a voice with nobody, people don't talk about this, like concealing voice, because who establishes the fact? For example, if disability not well, it's very weak, you have to go to some kind of hospital, for example, right? And when you get treatment, you don't know what kind of treatment. This kind of medical model is generated for many centuries. We should really realize how maybe value of it. It doesn't mean we give dominate, but we have to explore to identify, for example, even though medical record or nursing record, everything is by manual, but you need to have electronic data to indicate. Take their own medicine. If you be scientific, you be realistic on that methodology. You should not presume your judgment as a judge. You should use data to indicate it. So we can discuss in this issue, because I feel that if you run away from tiger, you can meet crocodile. I mean, I feel that who are they? They are from Mars. We are different level of the same. Medication, especially application of medication and biology, you need to identify. You do not conclusion. That's why I said informed consent, any participation. We can discuss. It doesn't mean you don't ignore them and you cannot, monitor them. How can you existence, because we talk in legal order now here. Disability live on the basis of legal order. That's a problem. That's why you try to raise the issue of equality. Equality and capacity can be together to help each other. Doesn't mean you have to have gap, but it's a gap because we live in legal order. So legal order is politics and social issue. But we need to combine existing structure because, especially on research ground, it doesn't mean as a tool. It opens your eyes in different direction, and the judgment can be better way. I'm sorry, take your time so much. Thank you.
Well, what I could gather from your intervention was the necessity of setting up dialogues between the two sets of. That was one kind of thing I did
to
get.
combine. First is identify first, especially data. The researcher is important is data because data everything have report, but if data for bias, so the outcome is I don't think it's maybe positive or negative, but I think the outcome is more difficult to see the picture. Because that's why I said when CRPD don't mention much about life to life. I feel that if something is not complete my picture, because the way we explore is important. When you talk about life to live rather than life to life, but disabilities, some of them they impair their daily life. They need to have life to life. They have to use that model. That means that this ground of more marginalized, nobody wants to talk because you don't establish about the model of what you call the scientific, as Professor Gabo said, that you don't establish things, so you don't need to participate. Because you establish things is only this one, you don't ignore that. I think difficult to understand for me. I could not criticize, I feel that I struggle, I try to understand. For example, life to live, you still need to have medical model.
You still need to have a medical model. Okay. Yes.
Thanks very much. Charlotte's doing a great job. Thank you, Gabor. Very fluid. I want to get back to the whole interface between what we're doing in our silo, in our mine shaft, and what's emerging from neuroscience and biomedicine. Quite obviously, the way that the Council of Europe has worked in crafting its own instruments is utterly indefensible. I mean, completely, utterly indefensible. Plus inefficient, because obviously whatever norm they produce is going to lack critical bite and push the envelopes. It's simply very deep in an outdated envelope, so that's taken as read. But when we were crafting the convention, we were thinking, actually our priority is to make sure that we are people too, and that human rights, although they're said to be for all, weren't actually for all. Hey, we're human too. And we want this shift from object to subject, but what we kind of left to one side is, well, what the hell is the human subject? I mean, to what extent, how can we navigate the tension between, the kind of American exaggerated notion of the isolated automaton exercising full autonomy versus the more European conception that actually we're a function of our human relationships. And I think it was Bishop Desmond Tutu who said a few years ago, to be human means to be in relationship with other human beings. But what's emerging from neuroscience right now is kind of the idea that the mind, the self, the auto itself, is largely, if not exclusively, a function of human interaction, human relations. And for example, Damasio's thesis is that the mind is not an a priori character or entity, it's actually a function of human relationships. Now you can spin that very, very positively to say we got it right in the convention, which is we got to stitch back together the possibility for having these human relationships, which actually is another argument for participation, right? Or you could spin it negatively to say, well, this is a profoundly pessimistic image of the nature and the possibilities of the human, and therefore in 50 years' time we can be seeing all sorts of manipulation of the human being. I won't go into that, but you know what I'm getting at. So I'm really interested to hear Gabor's instinctive reaction. Is there a marriage between what we're trying to do in the convention and what's indisputably emerging from the neuroscience field? Is there some way in which we can relate the two positively, or is it fated to trend inevitably negatively?
Thank you, Gerard. The scientist in me is still alive. It's buried, but it's alive. And I really do believe that scientific knowledge is a valuable knowledge. The problem comes, when it is given a power which is not really proportionate to what scientific knowledge is about. When it is politicized, basically, and it serves particular interests of a particular group of humanity. I do think that since the second half of 1970s, a lot of exciting neuroscientific discoveries have been made, which we can use positively. One of the early findings, which still interestingly did not find itself very well in mainstream neurosciences, which are dominated by high technology imaging things, very simple methods, also invasive methods, revealed that basically most of the time we make our decisions, simple decisions, elementary decisions, without using our conscious mind. They happen unconsciously, subconsciously, but we have the illusion that we made it consciously. And it's hardcore science, and it's reproducible, etc., etc. And a line of research has been made based on that finding, which I think is very important for us, and the positive thing for us when we conceptualize, if you like, the neural correlates of decision making. And what Article 12 paradigm is actually much more compliant with these recent neuroscientific findings than earlier paradigms to decision making. So we have some hardcore scientific ground to say that the incapacitation approach to legal capacity is not based on any evidence. It's a scientifically incorrect approach. It's a myth-based approach. And I do think that there are many other findings which can be used positively. And actually, I am not overly terrified about the possible abuses of biotechnology and neurosciences in particular, because if we really work on our human rights agenda for people with disabilities and otherwise, and if we combine it, or if we combine our efforts with social justice movements and democracy initiatives and movements, then we can contribute to the broader political frameworks, which should, in the end of the day, guarantee that humanity is going in directions which were more or less consensually agreed upon.
Just to add on, there's been this fascinating amount of work which is being done by some neuroscientists who are looking at the way in which every individual brain is so wired that you need to be like, it's like the kind of, I would say, a very analogous to the sort of point that we make with reasonable accommodation, that because every brain is so individually wired, you need to be sort of working out what's the way in which this individual person can be maximally performing. It's not like to be saying that, okay, every brain is made in this way, and only if you conform to that prototype can you be considered to be the capable person. The kind of, and that's the kind of paradigm, a very Newtonian static paradigm which we had incorporated into the laws in the way in which we constituted legal capacity, or we constituted, let's say, mental capacity. With neurosciences itself questioning that way of looking at mental capacity, I think there's a possible of joinder there, which would necessarily mean that we pick out those theoreticians, those neuroscientists who are speaking that language and try to see if we could set up a dialogue. That's one body of work which I think needs closer looking in. On our side too, in the sense of, instead of condemning all of neuroscientists as the biomedical static Newtonian way of looking at things. That could be one other way. I mean, I thought maybe worth looking at. Anyone else who wants to be chipping into? Yes.
This is for Professor Gambos. I represent the American automaton that Gerard was referring to. I was acting in a case for a young woman named Jenny Hatch, which got a lot of attention in the United States. She's a 29-year-old woman with intellectual disabilities. And essentially, she wanted to live freely in the community, and her parents wanted her to live in a segregated environment, take away her cell phone, and have visiting hours between 6:30 and 7, all of which she didn't want and was capable. So we got an order from the judge, first time in the United States, that she was entitled to supported decision-making, not plenary guardianship. But there was a discussion about the distinction, this is the question, the distinction between supported decision-making and what's considered in the medical context shared decision-making. And the way it came out, I'd be interested in your reaction, was without being too hard on the doctors, some of whom are well-intentioned, the conception of shared decision-making was not consistent with what we had thought supported decision-making would be. It was much more directive, much more, respectful of autonomy and individual choice. There was much less choice options available. And I'd be interested in your reactions with regard to the CRPD, because you referred to supported decision-making in the medical context. Is that distinction discussed in Europe, this distinction between true supported decision-making and perhaps more constrained shared decision-making in the medical context?
Thank you for the question. Is it? Yeah. Thank you for the question. I don't think I can say it is sufficiently discussed in Europe. And I used the medical context, I mean, the example of a medical treatment decision, because that is one area where I think very little has happened recently in European discourses also. And it's really urging. I can make this suggestion, that if we really want to answer this, then we have to step back a little bit from where we are in other areas of support to the exercise of legal capacity. Because, when we were advocating for extending legal capacity to include medical treatment decisions, then we were more or less forced to find evidence in the literature to build on. And of course, we went back to the old MacArthur's network studies on competence to consent and refuse treatment. And they are finding that there was no whatsoever significant difference in that competence, measured as they did it using the particular instrument to measure competence, between a psychiatric patient population and the general hospital population, which is a very hard evidence saying that it makes no sense to make a distinction based on impairment or disability regarding the right to consent or refuse treatment. Either you you recognize this right for all, or you don't recognize it for anyone. And of course, we wanted to go for the recognize it for all. But this really means that what happens in the name of informed consent for the general population is not very well understood, and very likely it is far away from what we would like to see as free and full and informed consent. So I think much research is still needed there. What it means for the general population, what it should mean. I mean, go back to the roots when legislations and policies were introduced about informed consent to treatment. And it's a relatively new thing. I mean, this mostly happened after the Second World War. and rethink that also, and rethink it in a disability inclusive manner, including persons with disabilities in our plan. And my idea is that likely we will find that if you really want to operationalize free and informed consent for the general population, then support becomes the rule and not the exception. I mean, these are very complex decisions to make. Can be, I mean, the knowledge behind that can be highly technical. What is relevant piece of that? What is not relevant piece of that? Who decides on that? It's a very delicate issue, but I think that we have to do something on that, and maybe raising awareness on this in the general population is a good idea to do. And of course, push all the discourses which may happen around it to include people with disabilities, especially people with intellectual and people with psychosocial disabilities. And yes, I agree with you that there is a huge difference, in my opinion, between genuine support to exercise of legal capacity and shared decision making. Frankly, I do think that sometimes I am going for, and now I am not necessarily talking about the medical context, sometimes I may want to decide that I want to make a decision in a shared way with someone of my choice, because I feel that the decision I am to make will have an impact on the other person also. That can be one of the reasons. Or simply, I do not want to take all the responsibility on my shoulder. I want to share it with a good friend or family member. But the problem is that when it happens in a context which goes beyond really trusted persons, then the power imbalance which is built in the situation prevails, I think. And even with the best intentions, if you do not deliberately counteract this power imbalance, then it will be a highly manipulated influence on the person and not free of undue influence.
Yeah.
So if it was a choice of fighting in the American Revolution or the French Revolution, I'd fight in the American Revolution. But it's funny how terminology, has such a hold over our imagination. So even to use words like free and informed consent, within that there's kind of a bias that we need all the information and we can rationally process the information, we rationally make a decision, which is not really how people make decisions. But it's funny how the terminology drags you in that direction. And then the key problematic, which I keep coming back to, is free. Because one strain of neuroscience says free will is a complete illusion. That there is no, anchorage point to the self. That we're all a daily product, a reiteration day by day of the function of our relationships. Now again, you can spin that really negatively. And then in fact, if you have a highly efficient polity, it might decide that it wants to bring out certain characteristics in its population and begin manipulating. And indeed, a critic of supported decision-making might say, from a neuroscientific perspective, that you're just substituting one form of sculpting the will and preference for another form of sculpting the will and preference. So that's what I wanted to try and bubble out here.
We'll need the mic here. Because it isn't.
I'm not addressing, Jared, specifically your point of what will and preference is and how do we decide if it's genuine, if it's not genuine. Or maybe I kind of am in a way, because I just wanted to make a point that I think is in line with everything that you've said, Gabor, and some of what you said as well, Jared, which is that decision-making itself is actually just a perception that we have of another person. It's actually completely subjective. There is really no scientific way of measuring how someone is truly making a decision and what that means and whether they're doing it according to some grand standard that we think is appropriate for legal decision making or not. It's all based on perception of how we see the person in front of us who we're judging, whose decision making we're judging. So decision making itself is a social construct, and then that relationship between the person being judged and the person judging them. And then, you know, will and preference, I mean, I think that there's actually something quite beautiful about the indeterminacy of will and preference. I don't think that we should actually necessarily strive to have some perfect test of what is a true will and preference and what's not a true will and preference. I mean, I think safeguards are always going to be important in order to make sure that support that is being provided by friends and family is positive and allowing someone to express their legal capacity in a positive way. But we all live under the oppression of our friends and family, and that's actually just part of living, really. And I think the only way that you can actually open up that space and have something, or have the best safeguard, is to provide options for people and to make those options real. So I think a big part of guaranteeing, you know, the most genuine will and preference is lifting the barriers that exist in the lives of people, and people with disabilities in particular, to open up that space for choice. The other thing I wanted to mention was what Peter asked about the discussions, whether there's discussions in the EU here on different forms of decision making and what that means. And I wanted to highlight the difference, I think, between supported decision making and support to exercise legal capacity, which could be so many different things. And so supported decision making could be a method for support to exercise legal capacity, or support to exercise legal capacity could be assigning a representative to make all decisions for you if that's what you want, or a variety of other things which we could talk more about, but I think it's not the space for it here. But I did want to say that in England, and actually Wales and Scotland as well, there's a lot of really detailed discussions going on, primarily in academia, about what supported decision making means, what capacity means, and in different realms, in the medical realm, but also in daily welfare choices, and in the financial realm. I'm involved in meetings with the Ministry of Justice in the United Kingdom right now, talking about whether the Mental Capacity Act is compliant with Article 12 of the CRPD. And it's organized by a group of philosophers in the Essex Autonomy Project at the University of Essex. And they have, for about, I'd say 5 years now, been doing really detailed work on a lot of the issues that Jared actually brought up. What is decision making? What is will? What is preference? How should the law interact with that? Does the law have a role to interact with that? And if it does, what is that role? So exactly what you mentioned, is shared decision making an appropriate intervention of the state, and shared decision making in a relatively coercive context, where, you know, it's a highly controlled largely by the medical profession. So I definitely recommend looking at their work. I think they're coming from a philosophy background, so while they're facilitating these conversations which are moving in the direction of rights, and Gabor is actually going to come with me to the next meeting in July, they're not coming from a rights framework or dialogue. So I'm doing the best I can to put that on top of what they're talking about, but they're definitely having those discussions around what the law, how the law should respond to decision making, and how coercive it's allowed to be, from a disability perspective, but also from a wider perspective of just when the law should be intervening in the lives of individuals and when it shouldn't.
Yeah, I would somewhere go back to the first point that you made, Gabor, that when you were saying that we need to contemplate about consent and informed consent, we should not be doing it only in the context of people with disabilities, and especially people with intellectual and psychosocial disabilities. It's when we do that kind of singling out that we then go further on to saying, all right, supported decision making, shared decision making, various ways in which decision making has to be constructed, but only for people with certain kinds of disabilities. But if we were to think of it in more generic terms as something which is needed for all humans, in the way in which people as such operate in their everyday decision making, then we might come up with a paradigm which is in some ways more equal and non-discriminatory. If you're talking in terms of range of choices and you're saying legal capacity on an equal basis with others, or we are speaking in terms of participation on an equal basis with others, we might well find that the options automatically open up. The reason for the options closing is the legal stereotype, is the kind of disqualification which subsists. And that, I think, needs interrogation of its own. And that interrogation, if joined up with the opportunities which are as such available, opportunities of making mistakes and learning or not learning from them, I think we might come up with a way of addressing this issue in a manner which is, yep.
I just want to come back to a point that Anna made about that we don't want to over-formalise this too much and try and get some perfect test for will and preference. And I suppose what I'd like to do is ask everybody whether they see that the process that we're in at the moment and this drive for the perfect test as part of the transition phase. And what we truly need to get to is an organic stage where people with disability are engaged in community, have intimate relationships, have solid family structures, and that the whole thing around will and preference and support is much more natural. But through this transition stage and through this period where we need to bring people along and we need to be able to give them confidence that we're going down a path that is workable, that we do need to put some boundaries around how it should work, and that we should create some benchmarks and some parameters about how it should operate, and that we see this as a transitionary stage, because I think there's something kind of frightening about formalising all this stuff so much, because for most people it is a very organic and, as Gabor pointed out, unconscious process.
The challenge in the legal context, as you know, is the presumption when an action is brought is for presumed lack of capacity. So that's the presumption from the start. And in the States, it's very difficult to have a presumption of supported decision-making capacity. With regard to, was it Anna, your comment earlier? We've, as a result of the Jenny Hatch case, we've actually just submitted a grant for the National Institutes of Health to develop measures of self-determination and loosely put capacity-related issues in the context of supported decision-making, which has not really been studied in the United States at all. It's quite surprising, actually. There are no systematic measures for whatever they're worth with regard to how you might assess that, both contextually and with regard to particular individuals as well. So just my point is, when you get into the legal context, immediately the presumption is a lack of capacity and you have to prove your capacity or your need for support, which is kind of like you're proven guilty until shown innocent.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that's wherein the CRPD paradigm is somewhere challenging just those presumptions of the law. Yes.
And perhaps in medical context, it's the same. You know, the doctor is presuming certain positions.
Yeah, I think it would be really interesting to know something about what doctors, and now I am not talking about psychiatrists in the context of a possible involuntary treatment, but just a general practitioner or general hospital doctor, what they think about the patient's informed consent. Does it make sense to the doctor? If yes, then does the doctor agree with the idea at all? And many other related questions which are not really explored, but I think would be necessary to know if we take the idea of, and I am not qualifying it now, informed consent seriously. But I really want to go back a little bit to not exactly what Rosemary was saying, although I agree with her that there are a number of tensions in this transient period, in this transitional period, as she described. And I can understand, why many people and authorities want well-defined parameters on the will and preferences, and I tend to agree with them. At the same time, I also agree that this should be just a temporary transitional thing to keep in mind, because it should end up in situations where people can enjoy those natural organic relationships where the things come much more smoothly. I wanted to address another implication of these issues. Very often, I think, people may have this impression following discussions like this that, oh, the CRPD is great, and we more or less understand what we need to do for people with physical disabilities, people with sensory impairments. But it's hopeless when we come to people with intellectual disabilities and people with psychosocial disabilities. We don't have knowledge. And if we don't have a knowledge how to do things technically with them, then it makes no sense that we have international human rights obligations regarding their rights. Because, yes, we have the intention, but nobody tells us what we can do, what we should do, and there is no knowledge available. Now, what I want to challenge is that there is no knowledge available. The knowledge is very much there, just that it's not part of this global, mainstream, recognized, technically double-checked knowledge. If you go to what, and I am just restricting my intervention to psychosocial disability, because that's the field where I am most knowledgeable. What colleagues and peers have been doing in different parts of the world in the past, I would say 3-4 decades, starting with the recovery approach, which has nothing to do with the medical recovery thing. It's a social recovery. It's actually a journey from recovery to discovery, and it is very much in line with how the CRPD understands a person with disability. Going to peer-run crisis services and approaches like my American peers developed, and now it's spreading worldwide. It started spreading in Anglo-Saxon, English-speaking countries, but it went already beyond that, what they call intentional peer support, which can be learned. And many, many other innovations about non-coercive, non-medical, relational, if you like, relationship-based supports provided to each other or to people who are in a crisis or who face difficulties in decision-making. Also, they were developed in an unrelated context. What we have been finding with a group in Hungary, a group of academics in Hungary, when we are trying to conceptualize the concept of psychosocial disability and who a person with psychosocial disability is in a theoretically firm way, we find that most of these bottom-up innovations coming from users and survivors of psychiatry themselves comply or can be made easily compliant with the CRPD. And you can even name that when they do this, then under the CRPD they are dealing with something which is under this or that article. For instance, intentional peer support. Much of what happens in intentional peer support is providing support to the person in a crisis to exercise his or her legal capacity in that crisis situation. It is not necessarily a supported decision making, but certainly it falls under Article 12. And many other things, relate to Article 19 things, to provide support which is necessary for living independently with support and being included in the community, etc., etc. So the local knowledge is very much there, but it's not really accessible to policymakers. And I think that it is another area where research, academic facilitated research, has a role to play to gather, analyze, digest, if you like, scholarly, these local knowledges and make it into a form which can be then presented to the policymakers. And then they will have no excuse any longer that, well, if there is no knowledge available, then let's forget about it. We would really be happy to implement the CRPD for these groups of people with disabilities also, but if there is no knowledge, I can't help it. I am a policymaker, I am not a scientist.
Yeah, I suppose, yeah, sure.
I would like to add I totally agree with Gabor about persons with intellectual disabilities and psychosocial disabilities are really marginalized, but I would just add persons with profound disabilities, profound intellectual disabilities and multiple disabilities, I even find further away. So it's something that even within the disability movement, it looks that yeah, participation is important, accessibility is very important, but it's not something for them. Or for instance, imagine to include persons with profound disabilities who can communicate only with eye contact, participating in an international conference, or even get engaged with the work of international disability organizations. I think there are huge barriers, and I think these are issues which we just tend to overlook when we talk about participation and mainly talk about the accessibility features. And I just also feel fragmentation not only within this context, but with I had a very interesting discussion the other day with a psychologist friend of mine who is doing the entry exam for teachers. If someone is able to become a teacher, and there was a guy with autism, and he wanted to become an IT teacher in high school, and he obviously failed the entry exam. And it was very interesting to see what were the arguments of the committee. And it seems that it's really about these structures, these exclusive patterns, just not changing. And it's not only the policy-making level. I think it's really the other disciplines. Because this psychologist friend of mine said that, for my sort of offense that it's highly discriminative, that this guy is refused based on he's lacking the capacities to become an assertive, strong teacher who can handle with the students, because he was lacking those communication skills. And she argued that anybody else, regardless of disability, would be refused. But if we take this further, it means that if you have autism and want to become a teacher and you have all the grades and you pass any other exams, you will still be refused just because you have autism and because this structure, this qualification system is not responsive at all, and there is no reasonable accommodation provided there. So I just find this very concerning as well, that these groups I just don't see them involved in our discourses somehow, and I think it would be very important to open up the space for them as well.
Can I just make a quick point?
So I'm a qualitative researcher, and my background is in inclusive and collaborative research for people with intellectual disabilities here in Ireland, and also I incorporated it into my dream research. One of the things that I argue about in my dream deliverable is ideological orthodoxy and conceptual orthodoxy, and often it's not quite in touch with people's realities. So what arose from my research was that often these concepts are problematic and other concepts are more important in people's lives. So often the key principles of the convention don't fully reflect people's lived experiences in everyday lives. They're often problematic, and people feel they have to have a public face where they show their compliance with a lot of these concepts, but in private it's a different situation. So I think that research really needs to be grounded in people's experience and people's diverse understandings of concepts and situations. There needs to be a lot of discussion around that, not just to look at the key principles and see them as, you know, gospel, to actually have more discussion around the diverse understandings grounded in people's lived experiences. So I think that's important also.
Thank you. I want to support what Annie just said in terms of the importance of thinking about how support gets provided, not just in the context of people with disabilities, but in terms of the wider community, and making sure that solutions are not proposed that deal with people being labeled as falling in or not in, or in or out of a certain category. Certainly I think, you know, Gerard's been very involved in work around people as they age, and you know, there are certainly a lot of the same issues that come up as people are aging, even if they, you know, if they haven't made advanced directives before, and there comes a point at which people start questioning the kind of support that they're given, or start making assumptions that other people, even if they don't have any legal authority, are actually stepping in and making decisions for people. Another point that I think is a real concern, and it's something that Inclusion International has grappled with a lot in terms of how to support members that are in countries going through some kind of a legal reform process, is the, you know, recognizing that ultimately we're involved in an organic process, as Rosemary said, and hopefully as people become more included in their communities, then the supports can be provided in more natural ways. But the challenge is when the law is being changed and you don't have intentional support, as Gabor talked about, or other the kinds of support systems that we want to see in place, or if people have been living in institutions very isolated from any networks, or if they are individuals who have severe or profound disabilities and there's nobody around who really understands their will, what gets put in place at that moment? And I think that's the concern that so many families of people with intellectual disabilities have, is that it's nice to think of what our communities will look like, hopefully in 10 years from now. But today, when those things don't exist, then how do we make sure that there's protection for individuals, but at the same time that we're not creating some kind of artificial standards that are going to be there, you know, and it's going to take generations to change.
Okay, I think for the first part of the morning, we've had some level of discussion around the tension that Gabor had put out between biomedical sciences and, let's say, the human rights paradigm. And also in a sort of a very subliminal way, we've also discussed some of the tension between global and local knowledge, between the mechanisms that we may need to put in place to see that the local knowledge which exists or subsists starts to get the recognition and the the acknowledgement and an induction into the more global knowledge. The fact that we are sitting in the academy and are discoursing on these issues, I think some of this would be like academic challenges too. And post the tea break, we have 4 researchers who have somewhere tried to build this bridge between the kind of local knowledge which subsists within the community, as well as to package it in a manner which is acceptable more globally. So with this, I sort of invite all of you for tea outside, and we come back and continue this discussion.